The audience expected a light-hearted evening. Jimmy Kimmel, known for his casual jabs and comedic banter, welcomed Clint Eastwood to the stage like any other guest. But the air shifted within moments. Clint didn't smile. His eyes were sharp, his posture upright, and his mood unmistakably grim. From the first question, something felt off. Jimmy leaned in with a smirk, throwing out a snide remark about Clint's age and his never-ending cowboy roles. But instead of brushing it off, Clint locked eyes with him and said nothing. His silence was louder than any comeback. What began as awkward tension quickly erupted. Jimmy pushed again, asking whether Clint thought he was too old to stay relevant in Hollywood. The crowd laughed uncertainly, but Clint didn't. He slowly leaned forward and hit back, not with humor, but with contempt. He accused Jimmy of being nothing more than a shallow performer, propped up by producers who fed him cheap jokes because he had nothing meaningful to say. The room went cold. For a few seconds it was silent. Jimmy's face froze, but his eyes were burning. It was as if Clint had peeled back a layer of showbiz civility and exposed something raw beneath. Jimmy retaliated, not by shifting the conversation, but by going for the jugular. He began questioning Clint's politics, his involvement in old controversies, even suggesting that Clint's legacy was stained by outdated views that should have been left behind in a previous era. The crowd didn't laugh this time. They watched. Clint, who had faced tougher men in war films and tougher critics in real life, was visibly angered. He didn't raise his voice, but every word that followed cut deep. He called Jimmy a coward for attacking real artists while hiding behind a teleprompter. He accused him of building a career on laughing at people braver, stronger, and more accomplished than himself. Every sentence was a challenge, and Jimmy accepted it. The conversation had officially turned into combat. What was meant to be a 10-minute segment became a war of wills, and the cameras were still rolling. Jimmy stood up mid-segment, something he never did. He took a step closer to Clint, his tone harsher now, the smile completely gone. He mocked Clint's past mistakes, throwing in references to failed projects and past scandals. He dared Clint to explain himself, live, in front of millions. Clint didn't flinch. He sat back in his chair, hands clasped, letting the insults wash over him before delivering a blow of his own. He said that Jimmy's entire platform was built on disrespect, that his success was tied not to talent, but to the public's appetite for cruelty disguised as comedy. He said Jimmy would never know what it meant to risk anything real. The audience gasped. Some clapped, others were stunned. By now, the control room was in chaos. Producers scrambled, unsure whether to cut to commercial or let the drama unfold. But the show stayed live. The cameras never blinked. Neither did Clint. And Jimmy wasn't backing down either. Two men from two different worlds, both refusing to break, both burning with something deeper than pride. Resentment, perhaps. Maybe even regret. The mood was no longer tense. It was volatile. What began as a subtle exchange of barbs had become a public dismantling of character. Viewers at home weren't sure whether they were witnessing television history or watching two legacies fall apart in real time. Either way, nobody was changing the channel, and neither of them was finished. Clint Eastwood's words lingered in the air like smoke after gunfire. The insult was surgical, not loud, not showy, just painfully accurate. Jimmy Kimmel stood still, breathing heavier, eyes flashing with fury. He hadn't expected Clint to strike back with such cold precision. For a few seconds he paced in front of the desk, pretending to laugh it off, but it was a hollow sound, empty of any warmth. The audience sensed it too. The cheerfulness was gone. What remained was a bitter standoff playing out on live television. Instead of calming things down, Jimmy doubled down. He stepped back toward his chair, looked straight at Clint, and said, he represented everything wrong with old Hollywood: ego, entitlement, and a refusal to evolve. He accused Clint of clinging to the past, of portraying toughness on screen, while being out of touch with the world he pretended to understand. Then, with a sudden pivot, Jimmy turned his attack personal. He brought up stories from Clint's past, failed relationships, rumored fallouts with directors, even a reference to a recent lawsuit that had been quietly buried. The blow was low, and Clint felt it. His jaw tensed, his hands clenched slightly, and his silence was no longer composed. It was seething. He had come expecting banter. He had come ready for jabs. But this was different. Jimmy had crossed into dangerous territory, and Clint had no intention of walking away quietly. His reply wasn't loud, but it was full of heat. He accused Jimmy of being a parasite in a suit, someone who thrived on other people's mistakes and never created anything original himself. He said the only thing Jimmy ever built was a reputation for smirking, while others fell apart in front of him. The insult was met with stunned silence, followed by a ripple of uncomfortable murmurs from the crowd. It was no longer entertainment. It was something else, raw, unscripted, and deeply human. Both men looked like they had been dragged into a confrontation they hadn't planned, but neither was willing to back down. They had gone too far. Jimmy leaned across his desk, lowering his voice but sharpening his tone. He warned Clint to watch himself, to remember whose show he was on. But Clint wasn't intimidated. He leaned in just as close, narrowed his eyes, and muttered a response that made Jimmy recoil slightly. Whatever Clint said wasn't picked up by the mic, but it hit hard enough to shake Jimmy's composure. The host leaned back, eyes wide for a second, then laughed bitterly before slamming his hand on the desk. He turned to the audience and told them to clap if they still believed Clint Eastwood deserved respect. The applause was faint, scattered, uncertain. Clint stood up. It was the first real shift in the power dynamic. The older man, silent and unmoving until now, slowly rose from his chair and stared down at Jimmy. The studio felt smaller, the lights hotter. Even the audience stopped whispering. Clint pointed at Jimmy, not angrily but with deliberate conviction. He reminded him that respect is not measured by applause or audience ratings. It's earned by character, something he implied Jimmy would never fully understand. The room erupted, not with cheers but gasps. Jimmy was visibly shaking now, though whether from rage or embarrassment wasn't clear. His voice cracked slightly as he tried to recover, but the words weren't landing anymore. The crowd wasn't, with him. The cameras were, though. They zoomed in on his face, capturing every twitch of the eye, every forced smile. He tried to pull it back to comedy, to steer the ship away from the wreckage, but the damage had been done. Clint sat back down, his eyes still locked on Jimmy. And that's when something even stranger happened. Jimmy's team began signaling him off camera. The producers wanted a commercial break, but Jimmy ignored them. He told them with a wave of the hand that this was his stage, and if Clint wanted to play rough, he was staying in the ring. And Clint? He didn't even blink. The fight wasn't over. The lights beamed down harder, as if the studio itself had turned hostile. Clint Eastwood sat like a carved statue, unmoved, his expression carved in stone. Jimmy Kimmel, normally so composed behind his desk, fidgeted with a pen he wasn't even holding seconds ago. This wasn't an interview anymore. It was a showdown, and both men knew it. What neither of them knew was how far this war of words was about to spiral. Clint had already humiliated Jimmy once, but now the fight had evolved. Jimmy leaned forward with a new fire, no longer caring about format or tradition. He accused Clint of hiding behind old awards and faded box office glory, calling him a fossil, clinging to relevance in a world that had passed him by. He said that, when Clint walked into a room, people no longer saw a legend. They saw a reminder of what used to matter. It was vicious, it was cruel, and it was deliberate. Clint didn't shout back. He didn't throw insults. He just stared Jimmy down, his face unreadable. And that silence, that unbroken stare, only made Jimmy angrier. He needed a reaction. He needed Clint to flinch. But Clint wouldn't give him that. Instead, Clint calmly called Jimmy a hollow man, a shell filled with noise but empty of value. He said Jimmy could mock the world but would never understand it. And he said it without raising his voice, without breaking eye contact. It was haunting. Jimmy stood up again, this time not for theatrics. He walked out from behind the desk and stepped toward Clint. His chest rose and fell in tight, angry breaths. The audience wasn't laughing anymore. They weren't clapping. They were frozen. The mood had soured into something close to dread. No one had ever seen Jimmy like this, cornered, exposed, furious. And Clint? He was calm. Too calm. Jimmy circled him slowly, speaking into the mic clipped to his shirt, so the entire audience could hear every word. He said Clint represented a dying breed of men who thought masculinity meant silence, who thought respect was owed simply because they had endured long enough. And then Jimmy did the unthinkable. He mocked Clint's military service. He joked about it. The crowd gasped. Clint's face changed. The fury didn't come with shouting. It didn't come with threats. It came in the stillness that followed. Clint stood up again, and this time there was something different in the way he moved. He wasn't preparing for another retort. He was preparing to end this. He looked at Jimmy and in a few brutal sentences stripped him of every illusion he had left about himself. He reminded Jimmy that fame without wisdom was a disease, that laughter without empathy was cruelty, that a man who could stand in front of millions and mock the sacrifices of others was not just a failed entertainer, but a failed human being. The words fell like bricks, each one heavier than the last. Jimmy didn't interrupt. He didn't smirk. He just stood there, shrinking under the weight of them. Then Clint turned to the crowd, not to win them over, but to remind them who he was. He spoke of purpose, of legacy, of the difference between temporary fame and lasting impact. He spoke as a man who had earned every wrinkle, every scar, and every ounce of dignity. The audience began to clap, not wildly, not performatively, but slowly, sincerely. Jimmy's face tightened. He looked lost. All of his tricks, all of his sharp lines and rehearsed charm had failed him. He had invited Clint for laughs, but what he got was a confrontation with someone who could see right through him. And now the room wasn't his anymore. The show wasn't his anymore. He had lost control, but Jimmy wasn't done yet. Wounded pride is dangerous, especially when it's broadcast live. He turned toward the camera with clenched fists and dared Clint to stay for the next segment, where he promised to show footage that would end the debate once and for all. Something personal. Something Clint wouldn't be able to spin with poetry and silence. Clint looked at him, then at the audience, then back at Jimmy. He said nothing. But his eyes told the crowd one thing loud and clear. If Jimmy wanted a war, he had just made it personal. Jimmy Kimmel didn't wait for applause. He gestured sharply to the production team, demanding the tape be rolled. The lights dimmed slightly as the screen behind the stage flickered to life. Clint Eastwood remained standing, arms folded, his expression unreadable. Jimmy stood a few feet away, breathing heavily, finally convinced he had found the weapon to cut through Clint's armor. The footage began. It was grainy, clearly old, and without context. It showed a younger Clint on the set of an unfinished film shouting off camera at someone unseen. The audio was clipped, the tone angry, the moment ugly. Jimmy turned to the audience and threw out a sarcastic question, asking whether this was the role model everyone was still clapping for. The screen froze on Clint's furious face. The studio, lights returned, but something was off. The audience didn't erupt. There was no shift in allegiance, no gasps. If anything, the room was confused. Some looked uncertain, others skeptical. Jimmy had expected a knockout. What he got instead was silence wrapped in discomfort. Clint took one step forward. He did not deny the footage. He didn't dodge it or try to dismiss it. Instead, he looked directly at the screen and explained exactly what it was. A young director, overworked and drowning in pressure, losing his temper during a shoot that had been sabotaged by mismanagement and egos. He admitted he had regrets. He admitted it wasn't his proudest moment. But then, without missing a beat, he pointed back at Jimmy. He said that the difference between him and Jimmy wasn't perfection, but responsibility. That every mistake Clint ever made, he faced it head-on. He never hid behind editing rooms or comedy sketches. He didn't take cheap shots to protect his own image. He bore the weight of his career, his failures, and his choices every step of the way. The studio shifted again. The silence turned heavy, supportive for Clint, damning for Jimmy. Still, Jimmy refused to retreat. His smile had vanished entirely. Now his voice a rasp, teeth clenched as he accused Clint of manipulating the moment, turning guilt into performance. He said Clint had always been good at playing the stoic hero, and that the audience was falling for it all over again. But his voice cracked halfway through, and for the first time all night, Jimmy looked like he didn't believe what he was saying. Clint approached the desk, calm but unshakable. He leaned slightly forward, just enough to make Jimmy flinch. Then he said something that gutted the entire room. He told Jimmy that the reason he had never earned the kind of respect he so desperately demanded was because he never stood for anything. Not in comedy, not in conversation, not in conflict. Everything Jimmy ever said had a layer of irony, a shield to keep the world at arm's length. And now that someone was finally confronting him without a punchline, he was crumbling. The audience, uncertain at first, slowly turned. People who had watched Jimmy for years were now watching him unravel. The camera caught the sweat on his brow, the twitch in his jaw. He looked like a man cornered by truth, exposed under a spotlight too bright to escape. Then Clint did something unexpected. He turned to leave. He could have stayed. He could have stood there and basked in the moment. But instead he gathered his coat, adjusted the cuffs of his jacket, and simply said he had made his point. Jimmy called out behind him one last desperate jab, asking if he was really walking away like a coward. Clint stopped in his tracks, turned his head slightly, and smiled. Not smugly, not cruelly. Just enough to say, "You're not worth another word." Then he walked off the stage. The audience stood. Not all at once, but enough to drown out Jimmy's silence. The studio doors closed behind Clint Eastwood with a quiet click, but the impact echoed like thunder. Jimmy Kimmel stood alone on the stage, the glow of the cameras now casting harsh shadows across his face. His shoulders were rigid, and his eyes darted nervously toward the control room, as if looking for instruction. But there was no saving line, no teleprompter prompt, no quick segue into commercial. This wasn't a sketch, and the damage wasn't reversible. The audience remained standing, not applauding anymore, but watching, quiet, contemplative, unsettled. Many of them had come for laughter, for easy banter and crowd-pleasing jokes. What they had witnessed instead was a raw dismantling of ego and identity on live television. And for once, Jimmy didn't have a punchline to offer. Backstage, Clint Eastwood didn't linger. He declined interviews. He ignored questions. He walked straight through the corridor, into the parking lot, and vanished into the night like a man who had said everything he came to say. It was Jimmy who remained, trapped under the lights, inside the very stage that once gave him power, but now felt like a courtroom where he had just been convicted by public opinion. Online, the fallout was immediate. Clips of the exchange were already spreading. Not the sound bites Jimmy hoped would trend, but the full, uncut footage of him spiraling, desperate for a win, while Clint remained cool and composed. Thousands of comments poured in, dissecting every moment, drawing lines between who stood for something and who collapsed when the script went off course. It wasn't a good night for Jimmy. It was a reckoning. Within hours, major news outlets picked it up. Headlines read like eulogies to a persona that had once seemed untouchable. Kimmel unravels under Eastwood's gaze. Clint walks out, crowd walks away from Jimmy. The story had gone from television drama to cultural moment. The studio issued a statement the following day, bland and calculated, calling it a heated disagreement between two creative minds. But the public had already decided. It wasn't just creative friction. It was one man trying to tear another down with cruelty, only to have that cruelty turned back on him with dignity and restraint. And in that reversal, something profound happened. Clint Eastwood, long seen as a relic by younger audiences, had done something no one expected. He stood still in the face of mockery, absorbed the blows, and responded not with rage, but with truth. Not just about Jimmy, but about fame, responsibility, and what it means to carry a name that still commands respect. He didn't win the moment with flash or sound. He won it with character. And in doing so, he reminded everyone watching that silence, when chosen carefully, can be louder than any insult. Jimmy, on the other hand, retreated. In the following episodes, he avoided references to the night entirely. He acted as if it had never happened. But the silence didn't protect him. It exposed him further. Fans noticed. Critics pounced. And the numbers began to shift. Viewership dipped. Trust wavered. And for the first time in his career, Jimmy was forced to question whether the character he built was real, or just a mask cracking under pressure. Meanwhile, Clint said nothing. He didn't respond to the media. He didn't return calls. But everywhere he went afterward, people stood. Not for his movies, not for his fame, but for the way he walked into a hostile room, endured a storm of disrespect, and left with his head higher than when he entered. The final shot wasn't of Jimmy. It was of Clint, walking alone under the studio lights, his shadow trailing behind him. Not as a symbol of fading relevance, but as a reminder that some men don't need applause to be remembered. They just need the truth. And that's what he left behind. A truth that shook the stage, and the man who once ruled it.